Revelations.Unveiled.Detroit. Lynching Black Veterans, the continuous review of the treatment of American citizens and military service people. Marching toward a movement, Black service in World War II. Lynching and racial violence surged following World War I, impeding widespread social activism and progress. The immediate post-war decade saw few changes in the overall social, political, and economic status of Black Americans. Despite their hopes, the service, sacrifice, and heroism of Black veterans, they failed to secure their full citizenship. As the United States prepared to enter World War II, its treatment of African Americans increasingly came under scrutiny, especially in light of World War II sloganeering about democracy and human rights. And a new generation considered whether, this time, military service might force progress. Despite the disappointment African Americans experienced after World War I, Black leaders nonetheless sought to leverage the United States war rhetoric to ensure equal treatment of African American servicemen during World War II, including the chance to fight in combat and earn the respect afforded to combat troops. Leaders like Dr. Du Bois had urged Black Americans to put their grievances aside during the First World War, but this time, Black recruits refused to enlist without assurances that they would have full access to the military's varied roles and rewards. As the United States entered the Second World War, African Americans created the Double V campaign, which called for victory over fascism abroad and victory over racism at home. The Pittsburgh Courier, a Black newspaper, coined the slogan and was influential in launching this campaign. In our fight for freedom, the editorial board wrote, we wage a two-pronged attack against our enslavers at home and those who would enslave us abroad. African Americans continue to reckon with a country that claimed to be fighting for freedom and democracy abroad while denying freedom and justice to its own citizens. As Roy Wilkins, editor of the NAACP's magazine, The Crisis, wrote, who wants to fight for the kind of democracy embodied in the curses, the hair-triggered pistols, and the clubs of the Negro-hating hoodlums in the uniforms of the military police? The Double V campaign created some legal and policy changes, but failed to achieve equality. The Selective Service of Act of 1940 allowed African Americans to join the military in numbers proportional to their representation in the country, provided for white and Black officers to train together, and established aviation training for Black officers, but also maintained segregation. In 1941, President Franklin D. Roosevelt's Executive Order 8802 outlawed racial discrimination in the war industry, but the enforcement body he established, the Fair Employment Practices Committee, had no authority to regulate employment practices and faced increased resistance from southern states. rather than agree to the FEPC's non-discrimination requirements. Alabama Governor Frank Dixon refused a government contract to operate cotton mills in state prisons for war production. Without Southern participation, the FEPC was doomed to failure. By 1942, nearly 1 year after President Roosevelt created the FEPC, African Americans comprised less than 3% of all war workers. In 1946, Southern Democrats in the Senate gutted the FEPC by eliminating its funding, and by June 1946, the committee had ceased to function. African Americans, nonetheless, joined up in increasing numbers. In 1941, fewer than 4,000 African Americans were serving in the armed forces, and only 12 were officers. By 1945, more than 1.2 million Black Americans were serving in uniform. Even as the United States proclaimed itself to be the world's greatest democracy, it was fighting the racism of Hitler's Germany with an army that remained racially segregated through the end of the war. Black troops initially were barred from front-line combat and assigned to service duties, cleaning white officers' rooms and latrines as orderlies and janitors. But as casualties mounted, the Army sent African American troops into combat out of necessity. Revelations.Unveiled.Detroit